talking about my PhD, so what I've done so far and what I'm going to be doing kind of moving forward. So just to give kind of a bit of background to my PhD, it kind of sort of stemmed from my master's project, which sort of mainly read around a particular area. And my master's project, kind of similar to some of the stuff that's been spoken about today in terms of looking at similarity in movements when performed in kind of different situations. So we were looking at similarity between two movements that we typically use within a gym setting to increase vertical jump performance, so that being a jump squat and a push jerk, and looking at similarity of those two movements to vertical jumping. And then we were also kind of looking at how load might impact that similarity or that relationship as well. And we categorise people as being hip dominant or knee dominant or using a balance strategy based on a ratio of hip and knee torque. And what we found was that, so if we take kind of a counter movement jump or vertical jump, we found people used a different strategy to perform that movement. And then when we put them into these different contexts where we pick those movements because we think they look similar to jumping, what we actually see is, besides participant number one, everyone else seemed to use kind of a different strategy to actually perform that task, and load seemed to impact that as well. So after doing that project, it kind of started making me read more around kind of motor control, why people move different, started getting me to read more around kind of movement variability literature, and that sort of led into my PhD. So I can imagine everyone's fairly kind of comfortable with this idea that biological systems are inherently variable. So no two repetitions of a movement are performed exactly the same within individuals and then between individuals as well. And traditionally, so kind of more from a sort of cognitive views on motor control, this was kind of deemed something that was detrimental to movement, something that should be reduced or got rid of in some way. However, we're starting to realise now actually that variability has some function, and it can kind of give us an indication to the state of that system and indicate kind of the flexibility and adaptability of that system to different situations and contexts that we might find ourselves in. And that variability is in part due to the redundant degrees of freedom within the system. So we have many more options available to us to actually perform a movement than are actually required. And that goes all the way from kind of your neural level all the way up to your joint level. And how we actually control those degrees of freedom throughout a movement is something that there's more research around and we're trying to understand. So that's what I'm trying to do within my PhD as well. So I want to try and understand the emergent motor control strategies, and we're also looking at the impact of constraints in vertical jumping. So we're using vertical jumping, not because we're specifically interested in vertical jumping as a movement per se, but kind of as a model to try and understand this to a better extent. There's a few reasons why we have chosen vertical jumping. So quite a lot of the literature around this area has been dominated by upper limb tasks. And we know that there are differences in upper and lower limb, kind of neuromuscular differences between the upper and lower limb. So we can't just take what we know about the upper limb and kind of translate that to the lower limb. What we also see within vertical jumping tasks is this proximal to distal extension of hip, knee and ankle. And we also see that in the upper limb as well. But the difference being between those two tasks is that in lower limb tasks, the distal aspect, so being the foot, is normally in contact with the ground for at least either the whole movement or at least in part of the movement. Whereas your upper limb models, your hand is normally free to move around and hold an object, but it's much more kind of freely movable. So we want to try and understand how we control that movement as well, that kind of proximal to distal movement. It represents a high velocity multi-joint lower limb task, so again trying to get away from kind of just single joint analysis. And then leading it into kind of more of a practical setting, it's a movement that is used in many different kind of settings. So you've got the clinical side of things, rehabilitation, performance. We might use that for a monitoring or sort of training perspective. And then more broadly as well, understanding vertical jumping has been used within robotics and prosthetics to create more sort of human-like devices as well. So there might be some kind of applications within that as well. So in terms of my first study, which we finally got published in this last month, it was quite a long review process, so it was quite nice to get that one out there. So we wanted to start trying to look at this control of degrees of freedom within vertical jumping. And we also wanted to try and understand the influence of a constraint within that task as well. So we used jumping with and without an arm swing. Our kind of first thing we wanted to try and understand was how are motor control strategies affected by the addition of that constraint, so not using an arm swing. We then wanted to explore different ways that we could analyse the data, hopefully in a kind of more holistic manner, so we have gained a little bit more information about the production of that movement. So we used what's called a principal component analysis, and I'll go into speaking about that in a little bit. So our question around that was then, what are the principal components that characterise vertical jumping between and within individuals in those two tasks? So in order to do that, we collected data from 38 participants. We looked at, collected kinetic and kinematic data so that we could obtain joint moments for the hip, knee and ankle. So we're just looking at the lower limb. And we asked participants to perform 5 counter jumps with arm swing and then 5 without an arm swing as well. So just kind of coming back to our sort of analysis of the data, so that's one thing that we were trying to kind of explore to a greater extent within this first study. So typically within motor control science, or even in any kind of biomechanical analysis, if we want to look at variability or variation within data, we will typically would use sort of standard deviation or coefficient of variation, those types of kind of analysis methods. And there's more and more approaches now that are coming out about how to analyse movement variability to a greater extent. But some of the limitations with those sort of traditional approaches, such as standard deviations, are that they assume that the mean is the gold standard. They assume the repetitions are independent from one another, so again, that might not necessarily be the case. They give us a measure of the magnitude of variability within the data, which is useful. But they don't give us any information or indication as to the structure of that variability. And one thing which is a very common kind of analysis approach is to use a discrete point analysis. So this is kind of figure indicates here. We might select particular points within a waveform, so time series, and we might pick, say for example, the peak and use that to infer some characteristics or differences between movements. But the issue with doing that is that then we're actually getting rid of a lot of data that might provide us some further information about how someone actually produced that movement. So it doesn't describe the temporal nature of the movement. Another problem we have with biomechanical data is we have lots of it. So we needed to find a way that most effectively analysed lots of data, but still was able to retain most of the information that we have within our kind of time series. So we chose to use a principal component analysis, or PCA, and this allows us to kind of characterise features within the data set. And so principal component analysis typically gets used as a data reduction approach. So we can reduce the dimensionality of our data, so we might have loads of variables, loads of individuals, loads of different trials. We can reduce the dimensionality of that data while retaining the maximum amount of information within that data set. So the whole aim of using PCA is we don't want to discard too much information, we want to try and kind of characterise all of that data set as best we can. Another benefit of using PCA is that it transforms the original variables into new uncorrelated variables, and these are what are called principal components. And that kind of gets around any issues with any kind of correlation with data that you might have as well. So in terms of how we applied PCA, it was slightly different to how it typically gets within the data, within the literature. So there's only a couple of studies that applied the same way that we have. So we perform PCA on an individual level as well as group level as well. So this figure I've got here is an example of the setup for the data for an individual. Okay, so we set up the data with columns being variables. So we have our hip, knee and ankle joint moment data in columns. So our rows are indicated by time points. Okay, so we normalised our data to 101 data points. So we had 101 rows and then 15 columns of data. Normally, that would actually be flipped the other way around. Okay, so we would actually represent our time points would actually be variables. So we'd have all of the joint moment data running across as rows, basically. Okay, so the way that if it's run like that, what it actually does is treat each time point as a discrete point within that data set. So it means that then the time point before and the time point afterwards are independent from each other, which we know that obviously in a time series that wouldn't be the case. Okay. Another thing that typically gets performed within the literature is to actually perform a PCA on each individual variable. So you would actually perform a PCA on hip data, then the knee, then the ankle. Whereas we've actually applied PCA across all of that data together. So what that means is when we're actually performing that data reduction approach, we're doing it within the whole data set rather than individually the hip and the knee and the ankle. So this gives us a better representation of the functional degrees of freedom within that data set. So in terms of the main results, so one thing I probably should mention before, so when we apply a principal component analysis, we import principal components, and they describe a certain percentage of information within that data set. Okay, so we can see from these two kind of bar graphs, each bar graph indicates a certain percentage of information within that data set. So obviously, principal component 1 is what it's called. If we look at B, for example, describes around sort of 75% of the variance within that data set, or the information within that data set for that first principal component. So we normally want to try and kind of look at the principal components that describe up to sort of 90% or over 90% of the variance within the data set. Okay, so and then we typically do then sort of discard perhaps some of the other principal components after that point. So what we found within our data set was that for the majority of cases that we analysed, we only required a maximum of 3 principal components, and for the most part only required 2 principal components to describe most of the information within that data set. Okay, so for both movements. So what that kind of indicates to us is that the joint moment production within those 2 tasks have some sort of similar structure with each other. Okay, so it's not just something that's unique to an individual, it's actually something, a movement pattern that is similar across a whole group. As I said, for the majority of cases, we actually required maximum of 2 principal components to try and describe a maximum amount of information within the data set. It was only when we applied a group analysis that for counter movement jump with the use of an arm swing, that we required an additional principal component to describe over 90% of that variation within the data set. And what we think that perhaps illustrates to us is that principal component 3 characterises some of the variation in technique between individuals when they're jumping with an arm swing. So it might be that introducing that movement, allowing them to use their arms, kind of increased the complexity of the movement enough that it meant they had to sort of explore different movement patterns. And that's what that third principal component we suggest kind of indicates. What we also looked at is what actually was meant by each principal component. So what information is contained within each principal component. So we reconstructed our joint moment data either just using the principal component 1, principal component 2, or the sum of principal component 1 and 2. So we can see that if we reconstructed the data just using principal component 1, so we've got the thick line indicates the reconstructed joint moment data, and the dotted line is the original joint moment data. So we can see from reconstructing the data just using principal component 1 that those curves look very similar for hip and knee joint, but we see that they are quite different for the ankle. So that would suggest to us that actually most of the information contained within principal component 1 is describing the joint moment pattern for the hip and the knee. If we look at then principal component 2 and do the same thing, actually we see more similarity in the ankle joint. So what that suggests is that most of the information in principal component 2 is described by the ankle moment production. And then this last row here at the bottom is, so we've used principal component 1 and 2, and we can see that all of those curves are pretty much aligned with each other. So that's suggesting to us that we can actually describe almost 100% worth of our data by just using 2 principal components, suggesting that there's only 2 degrees of freedom, or 2 degrees of freedom that we use to characterise these movements. So that was my first study. We've done that now, and it was relatively, I guess, simple in the sense of we didn't go into loads and loads of depth of that data set. So we want to start exploring a little bit more about the information within the movements. So we want to try and understand, again, the kind of degrees of freedom within the movement. We want to look at this proximal to distal extension within the movement to a greater extent. So we've applied a constraint at the hip, knee and ankle, so 3 separate conditions. And we want to look at how that changes what we've already observed, if it does. And we want to kind of look at it into a greater extent. So we only use sagittal plane data, so we want to try and look at it in a more holistic manner. So try and look at other planes of motion and try and describe what the task relevant and irrelevant degrees of freedom are. So what are most important to the production of that, or the outcome of that movement. And then moving on from that, we want to look at different phases of the movement. So there's some evidence to suggest that the task relevant and irrelevant degrees of freedom changes at different phases of the movement as well. So rather than just looking at the whole movement as a whole, we can start kind of breaking that down as well, seeing how it might change within different phases of the movement. And then lastly, to look at the influence of task demand on that emergence of movement strategies. So that's my PhD as it is so far. I also just wanted to mention another project that I'm running at the moment as well, which is again still looking at this idea of constraints. So typically when we use constraints, we normally have to kind of manipulate movements or tasks in some way to actually apply those constraints. We've got a really nice normal biological constraint, that being the menstrual cycle. So what we're looking at is how the menstrual cycle influences movement control across the different phases of the cycle. And then we've got a really nice kind of control group being individuals who are using oral contraceptive. So that's a project we're looking at the moment, so we're sort of coming near the end of our sort of data collection. So hopefully we are something next year maybe. But we're quite excited about that one in that we don't sort of typically think of that as a kind of constraint, but actually it is. We know that it does change movement in some way, so we want to kind of explore that again to